International News Review.
As always, Steve Okun, Senior Advisor at McClarty Associates, joining us for our International News Review. Steve, good morning.
Good morning, GBZ. Good morning, grumpy old man.
You see,
you
always get the positives.
Steve would never lie as well. I got to say that.
Slips them right in under the radar. They come right in. Good morning to you.
All right. Hey, Steve, speaking of a lot of old men and a few old women too, the G7 has just kicked off this weekend their annual 3-day summit in the UK. We saw Boris Johnson out talking about vaccines. We saw the Queen hosting them to a party. Give us the latest on what we know is happening there or is expected to happen.
Well, this is a really critical meeting because this is the chance for two things to occur. One, it's to show the world, right, the capacity of multilateralism, the capacity of countries to work together to solve our problems that we face as a globe. It's that the major democracies are best to tackle these big global challenges. And then for the United States, of course, is to show that it is back to the multilateral system as a partner and shift away from where Donald Trump had taken the United States.
And Steve, I was watching it, and anyone who hasn't seen it, do watch the photo op alone because the comedy, priceless. Watching Boris Johnson trying to arrange those guys on what looks like a windy, cloudy, grey Cornwall beach, priceless. But that aside, and we'll get to China in a moment, but it does seem a little bit of a, we're all in this together now. You mentioned there, it's liberal democracies unite against COVID-19, against the more pressing issues of the day. And I was watching it thinking, Steve, that China is hovering in the background. And it does feel there's I won't say us and them, but there does feel an element of, look, guys, we're all back. We're all united. Western world.
And Russia as well, right?
And Russia, of course, yeah. But I'm thinking more specifically about China, Taiwan, which we'll get to. It was an element of that, Steve, an element of, look, guys, we're all clenching our muscles together, Western world unite.
Well, and that is exactly what the G7 and certainly the United States within the G7 is hoping to accomplish. It's to say we have to stick together as we enter a much more difficult phase of competition with China and looking what China's done. The EU broke off in part from the United States during the Trump era because the EU could not trust the United States to work with the EU. So instead of uniting together to solve these multilateral challenges, you saw the EU negotiate its own trade agreement with China, very different from what the US was doing. You saw the US taking a much harsher approach when it came to sanctions and when it came to technology. So China's not hovering in the background, Neil. China is in the foreground on this. And that is what is going to unite the G7 is that we have to come together in competition. You start with simpler things like the COVID, like on COVID, and you donate 1 billion vaccines, and you don't do it for political gain. You do it because it's the right thing to do and how you solve it, and you give those doses to COVAX, right? So then they can decide where they're best needed, as opposed to doing vaccine diplomacy, which is what China has been doing. And the US, the EU were more or less on the sidelines, and China and Russia were using, COVID vaccines for political purposes. Now the G7's coming together to saying there's a better way. It's the multilateral way. And we're going to show the world, unite with us. And maybe that'll bring the US and the EU closer together on China.
Oh, Steve, the G7 would never do anything like donate vaccines for political gain.
No.
I mean, seriously, it's altruism all the way with the G7.
Especially when the likes of Oxfam have come out and said 1 billion is not even a drop in the bucket.
When there's 4 billion people that need the shots.
I think it was 13 billion around there, at least, if we're serious about vaccinating the planet. But hey ho.
But your point is well taken.
I was going to say, Glenn, I'm going to argue with you for a second, Glenn. But
sure, yes.
The public interest, right, and the political interest can be aligned, right?
Oh,
and that's
absolutely.
where
I
you
totally
are
agree with you
most
there.
effective. And that's what the G7 takes more of a, if we can achieve the public interest, that helps us politically, right?
Sure.
China goes in the opposite direction. What is in our political interest? And then we're going to do that first. We're going to give vaccines to those countries who we want to align with with us as opposed to with Taiwan. We want to use this for access to their markets when it comes to infrastructure or the such. So when you put the public interest first, the political interest often comes with that. So of course there's a political gain, but you get the political gain by doing what's right most of the time.
That's all I wanted to hear you say, Steve.
Yeah. No, I like it. Let's get a bit more feisty. But also, Steve, I mean, there's a literal economic interest here, isn't there? As we saw with the second and now third waves, it doesn't matter if your entire country is vaccinated, as we're seeing with the Delta variant now in the UK. Cases are going to reach 10,000 a day by next week, even though 60% of the country is populated. Unless you vaccinate the planet, you're always going to have a detrimental economic impact. So from an economic standpoint, they have to vaccinate the planet as well, Steve.
No, exactly, because you're getting more and more variants. And, what happens when we, get the variants that, the variants like Omega, right, which are way down the line from Delta. Will the current vaccines work? You've got to get people vaccinated beforehand. So it is in countries' economic interest not to just vaccinate themselves, but to vaccinate others. And look, it's not going as long as we'd like, but we were at zero, a couple of days ago. U.S. came in with 500 million. The rest of the G7 came in with another 500 million. That's $1 billion more than we were at. So yeah, it's not 4 billion, but it's more than zero.
Oh, to be sure. I mean, it's all good news. Whenever people can get healthy and stay healthy, that is a good thing, no matter where it's coming from. Your point well taken on the possible motives behind the scene. Okay, let's move on. We got a lot to talk about. China sanctions, the anti-sanctions law. Now, this is a rollout of a law against foreign sanctions. It's left European and American companies, they're saying, shocked, and irreconcilable compliance issues are on the offing here. Tell us more about this anti-sanctions law.
Well, this in a way came out of nowhere. Under Chinese law, before they promulgate a new law, there's supposed to be 3 readings so that people get a chance to look at it. There's public, consultation for at least you get to see what's coming. This came out with no public consultation. This came out only after 2 readings. So this surprised everybody because it was really sped through the Chinese government's own system. And what this is saying is it's getting very personal now, that if you work for a government that sanctions China, and this is directly about Xinjiang sanctions and sanctions on Hong Kong, we are going to go after you personally, and we're going to go after your family. And so this gets to be very difficult in terms of, one, government officials, will they be able to travel anymore? What do they do after leaving government? What do they do for their families if they're working for a company? Are they going to be at risk? And then it also goes on to say, if a company complies with these sanctions, then they could be eligible for this anti-sanctions law penalties in China, which could include deportation. This is going to be a nightmare to deal with as a business doing business in China.
I find it absolutely fascinating, Steve. And from a, on the ground point of view, how is this economically, practically even enforceable? Is it enforceable? I mean, do you see... how would it even work is what I'm asking. Would China's authorities march into an American business in the middle of the CBD and cancel their visas and send them home? I mean, how would it work practically?
Well, I mean, I think what the goal of this is not to do that, but to prevent the laws from coming in that might have ever come in beforehand, right? So they want to make it so impossible to comply with these laws that the laws never come in to begin with. That's what I think the aim is. It's going to be very, very difficult to do.
Wow.
Steve, I was reading one of the news reports. The European Chamber of Commerce has already come out strongly against it, as would be expected. The American Chamber of Commerce Chairman Greg Gilligan, has cautioned that this, quote, law presents potentially irreconcilable compliance problems for foreign companies. Now, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman says that he did not see a definite link between the new law and foreign investment. And he said, quote, if anything, the enactment of the anti-foreign sanctions law provides a predictable legal environment for foreign companies operating in China. So predictable, I guess, meaning don't do anything wrong or you're going to feel some pain. I guess that would be predictable, wouldn't it?
Well, no, I mean, I think that's what, because of that rule of law versus rule by law, dynamic that you often have in a country like China, where it forces businesses, because of the uncertainty, to not take actions whatsoever that may fall into that very gray area. And so that's the difficulty you have if you're a compliance officer for a company. How do you know whether or not you're violating Chinese law? You don't, therefore you don't do something beforehand. And it gets to be very difficult. This very much goes, against what China had been saying, just a week ago, right? We have to change all of our PR strategy. We have to become more modest and humble.
More open,
we have to become lovable. I don't know that this law helps along the lines of China being perceived as more lovable.
And I would assume, Steve, that your phone is going to be ringing off the hook at McClarty Associates. People companies trying to figure out what they're going to do and how they're going to respond to this, right?
No, I mean, and that's, part of this, this uncertainty that is very bad for businesses, but is very good for people who are in the political risk.
There you go.
Ka-ching.
Ka-ching. Hey, this plays on to another story. It's not exactly the same, but it is related, and that is this the U.S. top diplomat in Hong Kong, talking about the national security law with Article 29 that was passed a year ago. But this past week, in an interview with Reuters, he said that this law creates an atmosphere of coercion that threatens the city's freedoms, Hong Kong's freedoms, and its standing in the international business hub. This is quite unprecedented for the top diplomat to be so public in his rebuke over another country's laws, is it not?
Yeah, well, nothing has changed in the past year in Hong Kong. I think what you see changing is the U.S. is going to be more open and direct in confronting China, where it sees China infringing on human rights. This is part of that values-based diplomacy that the Biden administration is doing. It's where you see, the Secretary of State of the United States again said that there was a genocide occurring in Xinjiang, and said that directly to his Chinese counterpart this week. It's where you have the U.S. Consul General in Hong Kong saying that this national security law, which prohibits foreign government officials who are accredited in Hong Kong by the Hong Kong government to talk to Hong Kong people. I mean, how can you? That's part of your job. That's part of being accredited. And so it's no new policy from the Chinese government here, but it is a new view of the United States, certainly, that we are going to be very open and direct in sticking up for what we see are, universal values that we are going to promote.
And do you think, Steve, that is why? I mean, I do wonder about the timing as the G7 goes on now in Cornwall in England. You've got China with these anti-sanction laws. There's an element, at least to me, of saber rattling going on right now. Lines are being drawn in the Cornwall sand, quite literally, while you're meeting in the G7. Look what we're doing over here, which ties in very nicely to Glenn will mention Taiwan in a moment. There does seem to be an element of this now, Steve. I use the word belligerence loosely, but a slight element of that on both sides as they're both sticking in, if you like, bedding down for the long term.
What this is, it's the shift is Kurt Campbell, the senior American diplomat working on Asia issues, has said the era of engagement is over and the era of competition is now here. And so what you're seeing now is the U.S. doing this now on all fronts, that we are going to cooperate where we can on the pandemic and on climate with China, with Russia as well, where we'll cooperate with Russia where it's in our mutual interest to do so, such as in nuclear arms control. But we are going to compete and we're going to be direct. And this is not going to just be done for PR purposes. This isn't just going to be done at one-offs. It is going to be consistent. So I think you're going to see this type of in diplomacy, this type of directness all the time now, not just around a G7 summit, not just around a statement here or there.
Steve, just to be clear, this diplomat in Hong Kong, Smith, he would not have done this on his own. I mean, Washington would have had to known about this and approved it, right? The State Department would.
Oh, of course. Yeah, no. When you make a statement like this and you're an ambassador or in the senior U.S. official, such as the Consul General in Hong Kong, no, that goes through the State Department, goes through the the NSC. So this is
So
not
part of
going
this
to be
coordinated effort you were talking about by the Biden administration to talk about values.
Yes, much more coordinated now than it was under the Trump administration.
Yeah.
You now have a whole of government approach to foreign policy, and certainly to China, that was missing in the last administration.
Okay, John Cena, take that. All right, our final story here is about Japan calling Taiwan a country this week, which those of you who've been following this saga over the past few weeks is not something that Beijing takes kindly to. What happened, Steve?
Well, I imagine, unlike Mike Ong, Prime Minister Suga is not a regular listener of this show, or he would not have.
Wow. Well, look, we haven't heard that he doesn't listen.
Yeah.
We haven't heard that he doesn't listen.
We tend
so
to
he
be
may, in
half
fact,
full
listen.
kind of guys on this show.
We're assuming he listens.
Of course.
Well, Glenn, you need to mention his name when you do the rundown of the regulars. I've missed it. I've missed Prime Minister Suga in that.
They're always listening, Steve. They're always listening here.
Anyway, so a few days ago, he made some comments. What happened?
No, I mean, basically, it was this was really a slip of the tongue, as John Cena did. I mean, he was talking about, a string of locations or places that have been handling COVID. I think it was COVID well, was in that context. And he said, countries like Australia, New Zealand, and Taiwan. And it was just something that came out naturally. It's something that you wouldn't expect a prime minister to do, but it really was. It was a slip of the tongue. Unlike John Cena, the country of Japan is not going to grovel and apologize, and said, look, our policy is very clear. It's the same policy the United States has. It's there's a single country. That country is China, but they weren't going to apologize. China had to say what it said. Now, the interesting thing will be, will China take it further, or will they just say, don't do this again, and then move on, which is presumably what will happen. But in this new heightened era of global tensions, who knows?
And this is probably a question you can't answer, but clearly, again, even this example with Japan fits into the narrative of sides being taken up and in emboldened stances of all countries concerned. Where does this go from here? Do you see increasing belligerence on both sides?
Well, I mean, on the Taiwan issue, I mean, and I was on a call with a client, and we were just going over their website, and their website, had a tab that said countries, and it said, we are in 61 markets, and I said, or we're in 61 countries, and I said, go make sure your drop down does not list Taiwan as one of those 61 countries. Either you take off the list of countries if you have it, or let's come up with a different word. Is it
or be
market?
Prepared to face the consequences?
No, you do not want to face those consequences. And you shouldn't call it a country, because the United Nations doesn't recognize it as a country, right? It's a territory, it's a market, it's an economy. I mean, you could use whatever word you want, but you got to be, you do have to be careful, and you have to recognize the political sensitivities if you're going to be doing business in China, if you're going to be engaging with China diplomatically, and you have said officially there is only one China, and you kind of leave it vague. Don't call Taiwan a country. Call it, but you could deal now. That what is interesting coming up at the G7 is, but should you get Taiwan more engaged in multilateral institutions like the WHO, which they are not a part of? And if you're really going to have a way to attack the pandemic globally, shouldn't Taiwan be part of that effort?
Interesting. All right, let's close it off with your tweet about Neil meeting the Queen.
Now
I don't even know where to start.
We're talking about political insensitivities. See, I can't even say it. And there was almost a political furore last night because he's our friend, Mr. Steve Okun, alluded that Joe Biden had met the Queen more times than I. Well, until last night, that wasn't true.
Well, I asked. I didn't allude to. I asked. I said, I've met a couple presidents, but I've never met the Queen. I would think meeting the Queen is much more impressive than meeting a president. And so I was just wondering if you'd met a Queen. If you'd met the Queen, how many times?
Very briefly, the Queen Elizabeth II, when she came to Toa Payoh in 2006, I was there with my Singaporean friend. I said shamelessly, quick, give me your kid. And I put the kid on my shoulders. And the Queen kind of stopped and nodded, and so it wasn't exactly a banquet dinner. But I have met
hello, love.
Yeah, God blimey, Governor. I have met the Queen in Topayu, of all places, and Prince William
Did
as
she
well.
actually talk to you?
No.
Okay, so you really haven't met her.
Well,
You've seen the Queen up
Nor
close.
had she spoken to Joe Biden until yesterday.
Don't try to conflate the two. So you haven't actually met the Queen. You have seen the Queen up close.
Yes.
Thank you.
And I have seen
Oh,
Prince William's bald spot up close. And I will say this, I have had a letter from Prince William, an actual letter from Prince William, thanking me for the book that he was given that I'd wrote about Singapore. I had and he signed it. Well, I say he'd signed it. One of his butlers had signed it. But, you know.
He picked up his pen and just said, oh, yeah,
Right, so
Neil
Neil-
Humphreys. Yeah.
Yeah. So Neil, to be clear, you've met the Queen like you've met Loki.
Yes. And very memorable encounters they were. Mr.
Steve,
Okun.
this is why we have you on the show. You are welcome back every Saturday.
I think we've got another guest next week at 9:30. I've got Tom Hiddleston coming on.
All right, Steve Okun, thanks again. Appreciate your time today.
Thanks, guys.